that makes the fresco go. There's no such thing as a fresco without it. Lime putty, very, very important. But what is it? Unfortunately, we can't go down to the Home Depot and get a bucket of it. Historically, it was made in the following way. Boulders of marble or limestone, which is essentially the same thing. Chemically speaking, they are calcium carbonate. And that's a familiar ingredient for most of us. If anybody takes stomach medicines, Tums and Rolaids, calcium carbonate. It's essentially ground up chalk, limestone or marble. Okay? So marble, large boulders of it, are put into a kiln and fired up to a terrifically high temperature and literally burned. While that burning goes on, the marble loses a molecule of carbon into the air. It becomes chemically calcium oxide. And these boulders of now calcium oxide are highly unstable. If they get wet, they explode. So one has to be very careful with them. This is not something we do in the backyard at the monastery, by the way. But this is a difficulty because it's hard to find these ingredients in the United States. The calcium oxide boulders are then taken and they're plunged into water where they disintegrate with an explosive reaction. This is called slaking the marble. It's being soaked, essentially. I have seen calcium oxide slaked. The boulders had been pulverized into a fine powder and shoveled into a large bucket of water, which all of a sudden started bubbling and giving off heat, and then went whoosh, like a volcano. Because we all jumped back. We had been warned, so it was a controlled situation. And then it settles down, and it dissolves in the water. The calcium oxide becomes a thick, viscous paste, which is no longer dangerous, and that's what we call the lime putty. It is now calcium hydroxide. Okay, so we've had two chemical changes so far. Now that calcium hydroxide, or lime putty, will stay wet and soft indefinitely, as long as it's covered with water. So historically, people who were going to build a building, or plaster walls, or mortar stones together, because the lime putty was used for all of these purposes, they would build a lime kiln. They would, if they didn't have marble, they'd have to import it. They would fire it up. They would fill a pit with water, put all of the calcium oxide into it, let it bubble and burn, and then they'd cover it all over for 40 to 50 to 60 years, because it takes a long time to become properly workable. Okay? So this generation of fresco painters would lay down the lime for the next generation of fresco painters. And in fact, wherever you find an old Greek temple, a medieval cathedral, chances are they'll find a lime pit or signs of a lime pit somewhere nearby, because you had to have it. Nowadays, they will pressure hydrate the burning marble, and it will work faster. What Father Moses and I work with is we get lime putty that has been dried, pulverized, sold in a sack, and we re-wet it, okay? So we get a big bucket of the same lime putty, okay? Whether or not it's as good as the old-fashioned kind, we're actually doing experiments, as a lot of people are, because fresco painters like Javier and Father Moses and I have a hard time finding these materials. You could import special fresco plaster from Germany or France, where it's, in fact, not expensive. Because in Europe, people still do fresco painting, and they use these lime putties for plaster. So it's not difficult to get, but it's very expensive to import. And just picture, you're painting a whole big wall. You can't import lots of little buckets, or even big ones of lime. It's too expensive. So enough about that. We take the lime putty, and we mix it with an aggregate. Historically, the aggregate might have been crushed stone, pulverized marble. The Romans used volcanic ash. We are using sand, as you can see here. We've washed the sand so that there's no dust or dirt in it. It's nice, clean sand. This is what you saw, the photograph of Javier and Father Moses mixing together in the trough. And so we get the plasta, or another word for that is mortar. And here it is, okay? Now, I don't have to go into much explanation about exactly how we plaster. Father Moses is going to show that in a minute. But I'm going to run over just the basic perimeters of what happens with the plaster. We could just slather a little plaster on the wall and then paint on it, which actually work. But we've got very large compositions to do. So we take a lot of steps, and for this there are lots of different recipes of fresco painting. Most fresco recipes involve at least 3 layers, but there may be 2, there may be 7. If you read art history that analyzes the old frescoes of Europe, they will talk about how thick the plaster was, what was in it, infinite varieties. We compare it to making bread. If I were to send everybody home with a bread recipe, the same recipe, tell everybody come back tomorrow with your loaf of bread, they'd all be different. Because your material is a little different, your hands are a little bit different, your kitchens are a little different. This is homemade paint, homemade plaster. We use a typical, essentially 3-layer technique. We actually end up spreading that out into 5 layers, depending on the wall. The first layer is put onto the wall that is going to be frescoed. Now, normally, that frescoed wall would have had to have been a stone wall or a brick wall, because the plaster's got to grab onto something that is stable. Remember, our fresco's fate is forever tied to the fate of the building. So you've got to have a stable surface. The modern world has happily come to our rescue once again, because Americans don't build as old Europeans and ancient people did. People were building a building in ancient Greece or medieval France. They expected that building to be, they built it as if it was going to last for hundreds and hundreds of years, which they did. But what American space do you know, like a kitchen, where the builders are, well, are you going to guarantee this for 500 years? It's just not part of the way we build stuff here. Now, it can be, of course, but you're talking specialty contractors and all of that. Nowadays, if we have a wooden or a drywall, or a wall that's a mixture of things, in Santa Rosa we've got cinder block, cement, and furred out walls that are sheetrock. So we put a moisture barrier that's plastic and a little tar paper on, and then we staple with galvanized staples that will not rust, because remember, that fresco is going to be there a while, hopefully, God willing. You don't want something underneath it that rust is going to come through. So we staple this expanded, I don't know if you can see it, you can have a look at it if you can't see it very clearly after the talk, expanded metal lathe onto whatever surface we want, and then we can go ahead and plaster. It's not as good as an old-fashioned stone wall, but it does the trick. And a lot of the individual techniques that we've developed are for doing a dry wall in Santa Rosa, California. If we take our techniques to Boston, we'll have to adjust them somewhat for climactic considerations. We're finding at St. Seraphim's, every wall we start on, we have to do experiments because they're all a little different. Even though the same material, same plasterers, well, there's a couple of different companies. The first layer is put on, it's a very rough plaster. If you pull your fingers across it, it almost hurts. It's so rough. The lime putty is mixed with a small amount of very rough sand, and then when we get it all on, we scratch it with a comb that's made out of little nails. So we really scratch it up. It's almost like the plaster is like a rock climber. It needs something to grab onto. So the rougher the better. We had a hard time with our plasterers convincing them of this because, of course, they were artists with a trowel. They put that plaster on, they wanted to look a certain way. We'd come back, there'd be a couple little delicate scratches, and it was, oh, no, scratch and scratch and scratch. And you could see the look of horror on their faces. But they got it. We actually had a wonderful crew up in Santa Rosa, a local man. The next layer, we use a little bit finer sand, and instead of scratching it when it's put on, we rub it with a piece of wood called a float, okay, like this. It makes the overall plaster flat, but it brings the sand to the surface, and it's rather rough, like a piece of sandpaper. Because again, the last layer of plaster wants something to grab onto, but it is a little bit smoother. The church I showed you in Santa Rosa, the entire church has been done with these 2 layers of plaster. The last layer is done the night before the painting happens. You have to plan ahead, because every brushstroke of fresco is permanent. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is why that is.